I want to share a little bit about a vision for a Christian social graph. Now, I'm the executive director of Tech Mission, and we've worked with hundreds of Christian organizations, and I've talked with hundreds of individuals that all have a similar vision for technology on the internet with Christians. And in essence, what that vision really is, it's asking the question, what if every Christian could connect with the needs and resources in the world to maximize their calling on earth? And there's different aspects of that. You know, in missions, there's mapping every need in the world to Christians with resources to meet that need. In discipleship, there's mapping every Christian with the resources they need for growth. And, you know, I've been asking myself really for about the past 10 years, why have so many Christians had the same vision? And I think the real reason for that is it's something that God's doing. And I want to, go next into asking a question, which is, what's the largest social network in the world? And whenever I ask that question, most people say Facebook, because Facebook has 900 million users whenever I'm presenting that. It's rapidly growing. But it's not the largest social network in the world. It's the largest online social network. The largest social network, if you use the term and how sociologists use it, and they've been using it way before technologists got a hold of it, is the global body of Christ is the largest social network. And that's over 2 billion Christians. Now, the problem is that the global body of Christ is disconnected. So what is the Christian social graph? Really what it's about is connecting Christians. And it's a social utility to connect Christians and resources. So it's similar to the Facebook social graph. And what the Facebook social graph really is it's a technical map of all the resources on Facebook. But the difference is that it's more open and more focused on mapping resources that are of interest to Christians. Another way of defining the Christian social graph is it will be how Christians contribute to the semantic web. Now, I'm not inventing a Christian social graph. There's already a Christian social graph out there. The question is how do we build it to be more robust, larger, and more connected with the rest of the world and the standards that are already out there, in what many people are calling the Web 3.0 standards. And this is actually led by the guy who invented the World Wide Web, Tim Berners-Lee. And he's working on standards called the semantic web, using things like RDF, schema.org, and in the more proprietary side, the Facebook Open Graph API. But what I really think this Christian social graph is it's going to be a set of data format standards and terms of use for sharing data that allows Christian organizations to share data in a more open way. So this next slide shows just a map of what the Christian social graph looks like. The Christian social graph is a bunch of different objects that are of interest to Christians. That could be volunteer opportunities, so you want to serve at a rescue mission or a short-term missions trip internationally, that I would say is also a volunteer opportunity. Christian jobs, it might be Christian organizations, nonprofits and parachurches. It might be churches, it might be people, could be Christian classified listings. A lot of churches will post classified listings, within their church, but what if we could open those up to be shared more widely within a city or globally? And then, wouldn't it be great if we could have a map of all the Christian small groups? How can Christians share content and pages? What about sharing events? So, as I've talked with, there's hundreds of people or thousands of people who have a similar vision of doing this. What I'm really trying to do that's different here is to really talk about some of the standards of how we might move towards that, because the Web 3.0 and semantic web is starting to provide some of the standards that we could do. So the next question is, why is the Christian social graph important? I've been working within this domain of, I would say, the Christian social graph for the past 10 years. My own background is I studied computer science at MIT and technology and policy at MIT, served under one of the fathers of the internet, who is the chief protocol architect of the internet. And standards are very important. If Christians don't pay attention to those standards, especially with the semantic web, then Christians are going to end up ghettoized, and they're going to end up being insignificant in some of the larger technology things that are happening. So, but creating a Christian social graph is a huge task, and I know how hard it is because I've been working at it for 10 years, and it's going to take probably hundreds of millions of dollars of resources of thousands of organizations. So it's too large for any one organization to create the Christian social graph. So we're going to have to work on standards. Otherwise, Christian data is going to be splintered and staying in inaccessible silos as it is now if we don't think about those standards. And really the payoff and the benefit is this vision that we could help connect every Christian with the needs and resources to maximize their calling on earth. So let me just talk about some of the problems that happen because there isn't a very robust Christian social graph and people aren't sharing very openly. Now, one area is within the sector of Christian jobs. My assessment is that there's probably between 20,000 and 100,000 Christian jobs online globally. But the problem is a Christian who is searching for a job would need to search for potentially hundreds of Christian job sites, and most of these Christian job sites each have less than 5 or 1% market share. There's a few that might have 5% market share. There's hundreds of thousands of churches and parachurches that have posted jobs on their individual websites, but they're not in any job directory. And then there's a lot of Christian jobs that are on secular sites. Now, not all Christians are going to want to apply for a Christian job, but it would be nice if Christians who wanted to find a Christian job could go to a job website and find one. But the problem is that the usability for a Christian job seeker is horrible compared to someone who's looking for a secular job. So if you're looking for a secular job, the top 5 job websites have probably more than 80% market share. So there's Monster.com and Career Builder and a few others that have about 80% market share. Now, the top 5 Christian job sites have less than 20% market share. So the end result is that if Christians are looking for a Christian job, they just can't find it, and the end result of that is that there's more secularization. Now, I'm not for building a Christian ghetto, but what I am for is retaining resources within the Christian community that are already a part of the Christian community. So there's another problem that happens, is another example, is the problem of secularization. And Tech Mission runs the largest Christian volunteer website called ChristianVolunteering.org. We have over 10,000 volunteer opportunities from around the world. And we've seen this problem in this space because if Christians can't find Christian volunteer opportunities in Christian ministries, they're going to serve in secular ministries. Now, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but what happens is these secular online volunteer matching sites, they end up having a significant bias against Christian organizations. And I've worked with a lot of them, and I've seen that bias. I've seen some of their sites will have more volunteer postings for Planned Parenthood than all the other Christian organizations combined. And that's not the way the world really works. 40% of all volunteers in the United States, and probably even more in other countries that are Christian, it's going to be different, different countries, but are in faith-based organizations. But these secular sites, only 3% of their opportunities that they have listed, the volunteer opportunities are listed as religious. So these online volunteer matching sites are just like Monster.com. They match people to volunteer opportunities. But what's happening is whenever people go to these secular sites, instead of going and serving in Christian ministries, which is what they've largely been doing before the internet because they found volunteer opportunities through word of mouth, now they're going to serve more, are going to be directed towards secular opportunities. So the difference is that Christian volunteering is worth hundreds of billions of dollars worth of resources. The biggest asset we have as Christians is the body of Christ, beyond Jesus and God, but it's love God and love others. So the biggest asset we have is that volunteering aspect of Christians. And if you just take a conservative estimate and you say that, you know, that you take $100 billion worth of volunteering, and if you do it through word of mouth, 40% of that is going to be $40 billion, and that's the way the market worked before the internet. After the internet, it's more likely to work to where you have $100 billion, and if people just pick opportunities randomly, they're going to end up, you know, at 3%, and all of a sudden you're losing $37 billion worth of volunteering. So that's a major issue. And what's going to happen is there's going to be a major secularization, a major loss of volunteer resources to ministries and churches. So what our goal around the volunteering space is to avoid secularizing Christian resources, but also avoiding creating a Christian ghetto. And we can avoid creating a Christian ghetto by working with some of the global standards that are out there. So why is Tech Mission interested in the Christian Social Graph? Tech Mission's had relationships with most of the organizations and ministries that could serve as potential data sources to the Christian Social Graph. Currently, we're the largest aggregator that we know of Christian volunteer opportunities and organizations, and hopefully soon we will be on jobs. And we've also been engaging a lot with the larger standards world in some of these secular counterpart initiatives. So in volunteering, that's All for Good. They aggregate all the volunteer opportunities in the United States. There's also 211 in the United States that is basically the equivalent of 911 for emergency services, but focus on social services. So someone could call 211 and say, I'm homeless, and they would direct them to a homeless shelter. And then there's a lot of other standards that we've connected with. So just a little data on ChristianVolunteering.org. Right now we have 6,171 volunteer opportunities that were posted by users in the past year. We have about 5,000 that came through feeds. We expect to have about 10,000 through feeds by next year. We have about 6,500 organizational profiles that have been posted by our users, and about 55 organization profiles that have been imported. And then we expect to have 10 to 20,000 Christian jobs by spring of 2012. And we do a lot of things. In addition to aggregating this data, we provide widgets for that. We provide apps for iPhone, Android, Facebook. We provide the ability for groups to do rebranding. We provide citywide directories for this data. And on top of that, we have one of the largest Christian Creative Commons or open source wikis with 160,000 items of content. So we've been looking at some of these issues for a while. And our assessment, and what we're going to do is we're going to go through each of the components of the Christian Social Graph and talk about what that market looks like and what it might look like to create a standard. So right now, our assessment in the Christian volunteer opportunity space, Christian volunteering has about 50% market share. Our guess is there's about 20,000 volunteer opportunities that are posted online. Our guess is there's several 100,000 or possibly a million that aren't posted online. But of those online, we think that Christian volunteering has about 50% market share. Short-term missions has about 5%. There's other groups, Meet the Need, Mission Finder, Catholic Volunteer Network. A lot of denominations will have volunteer opportunities on their sites. There's a lot of mission sites, and then there's a lot of local volunteering, Christian volunteering directories. But the problem is most of those are 5% or 1%, so they're very scattered. So we're trying to do a lot of aggregation of those opportunities. For secular sources, I would say that the secular websites have about 20% of the market share of Christian volunteer opportunities. So a lot of Christian organizations are posting on the secular sites, but not that many. I guess there's a decent number, but not that many. Volunteer Match, I would say, has about 5%. Now, the next part that we looked at is we did some research on potential schemas. Now, what schema is it's basically like if you had a spreadsheet, what would be the fields in the spreadsheet? So there's different groups that have looked at what would be the fields that you would use in the spreadsheet that define volunteer opportunities, and All for Good has done one of the more extensive specs on that. Christian Volunteering has one, and Schema.org is the biggest attempt to create standards around these specs in a way that covers the entire web. They don't yet have a volunteer opportunity, but I expect they will soon. And I would say that volunteer opportunities are pretty ready to being to having a standard. And what that would be is that would be a standard where different organizations can share their volunteer opportunities more openly, and I'll talk a little bit more about how that would work. Jobs, if you look at the market, ChristianJobs.com, ChurchJobs.com, both have less than 5% market share. There's other groups that are creating church portals like NeedsMet, and then there's hundreds of Christian job sites that are out there, and combined they might have 30% market share if you counted all of them. And then there's a lot of individual organizations and churches that are posting jobs on their website. Then there's secular job aggregators. The two big ones are Indeed.com and SimplyHired.com. These sites work essentially like the travel site Kayak, which is a search engine of search engines, except is a search engine of job search engines, and it provides a faceted search to basically for almost all the jobs that are out there on the web. So there's schema examples. So schema.org has a job posting definition. Indeed.com and Simply Hired has a job posting too. And I would say that also is ready for a standard. Then organizations, there are Christian sources for organizations. So ChristianVolunteering.org, as I mentioned, has about 10,000. National Christian Foundation, I believe, has close to 10,000. ECFA has a couple thousand. And then there's other groups like Ministry Spotlight that are trying to find how to integrate those. And then there's secular sources. So All for Good has lists of organizations, GuideStar, Charity Navigator, and there's specs that are out there for how to use standardized definition for organization, Schema.org and All for Good. For the most part, the way people are mapping organizations is using some sort of, in most countries will have a government identifier for nonprofits or non-governmental organizations. So in the United States, that's called the EIN. Globally, there's going to be other, sometimes it's a charity registration or things along those lines. But that's going to be one of the primary keys that we would use to map various organizations. So what's interesting is, secular providers are leading the way in technology, and it's really interesting to look at how they are using linking together. So a lot of organizations are using a nonprofit's EIN or employer identification number to map to different resources. So you can, for a given organization, you might be visiting a website about that organization, and then you could link to their volunteer opportunities on a different site. So Network for Good and All for Good can provide that capability. Volunteer Match and All for Good. For donating, a lot of groups will use Network for Good. GuideStar has an organizational database and the tax forms, the 990s, and also helps, I think, with some donating. And then there's other organizations like Idealist that you can search for jobs on a given organization. Now, that's one way of mapping. The other is there's a lot of groups that are accessing that data from these secular sites through web services APIs, and they're creating widgets and Facebook apps and mobile apps. So there's the Catalista volunteer app, which uses the All for Good API. There's Create the Good, which is for the Association of Retired People, that has their own app. Johnson & Johnson actually, I think, has what I think is going to be the future of most of these apps and widgets, where it is linking all the aspects of an organization, volunteer opportunities and jobs, and I'm going to show an example of that in just a minute. And then there's also secular social service aggregators. So All for Good currently is aggregating, it's the largest aggregator within the United States. It's aggregating over 100,000 volunteer opportunities from 20 data providers. One of those is Tech Mission and Christian Volunteering, where we're currently providing over half the Christian volunteer opportunities for serve.gov. and they're providing the search that the U.S. federal government uses. And the way this typically works is they provide an API key also to third-party distributors. So they, a lot of media websites will use them, like Huffington Post, and then at websites that have an interest in volunteering, like Association of Retired People and Care2 and AmeriCorps, are using their API. There's other groups that are aggregating jobs. So as I mentioned, Indeed.com and Simply Hired. Then the primary aggregator for organizations is GuideStar. So Johnson & Johnson has a very interesting widget, and I think this is going to be the future of widgets. What they have, and if you go to their website, it's andyu.jnj.com. You can see how their widget works. For any organization, all you have to do is give them your employer identification number if you're based in the United States, and it will provide a widget that shows all your volunteer opportunities, all the jobs, all the events, and ways to donate to that organization. Now, the catch is that it's not all the volunteer opportunities and employment opportunities, because the social, or I guess semantic web, hasn't been fully built, and the social graph isn't complete. So it's only showing, right now, it links to volunteer opportunities from Volunteer Match. It shows employment opportunities from Idealist. It shows events from Idealist, and then the donates provided by Network for Good. But you can imagine that Christians could do the same, where you could show all the Christian volunteer opportunities, all the employment opportunities and events for a given organization. Or you can imagine a widget like this for a city. All for Good is, as I mentioned, providing apps. If you have an iPhone or Android phone, you can download an app called Catalista that allows you to search for volunteer opportunities. And then they also, by providing their API, allow groups to do specialized apps and widgets. So Earth Day has an app. There's one, about pets for people who want to volunteer with animals, that was sponsored by a pet food company. So once you start to provide APIs, the potential is kind of limitless. So the question is, how should Christians take advantage of some of these innovations? How should Christians link up? What we would love to do at Christian Volunteering is we would love to link to organizational data with some of these Christian groups, like National Christian Foundation, Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability, and GuideStar. We're already automating links to donate through Network for Good and somewhat GuideStar, using people's employment and identification numbers. The other thing we're going to be doing in the future is we're going to be providing an API and a feed of data for people who want to develop their own way of interfacing this data. And then, so that's ChristianVolunteering.org. There's other people who are data providers for organizations. And we would love for them, so National Christian Foundation, ECFA, and other groups, to have a link, say, volunteer with this organization, and then they could find the volunteer opportunities based on an employer identification number for that organization. And we'd love for these organizations to provide an API or export or feed of some of their data. And then what we'd love to have happen is we'd love to see third parties have access to APIs or feeds of Christian data, similar to the way secular providers are providing, so that Christian groups can create custom websites and apps. So just a picture of what that could look like. Right now, Christian Volunteering, we have an organizational profile that shows information about an organization, and you can click to view that organization's volunteer opportunities. Right now, we have a button to donate to the organization, and that uses their employer identification number to link into Network for Good. But we'd like to provide links to groups like the National Christian Foundation, GuideStar, ECFA, and things along those lines. So the question is, if there's a Christian social graph, what are going to be the roles in this? There's a lot of different groups. So there's aggregators like ChristianVolunteering.org, where we're trying to aggregate data. ChristianVolunteering.org is also a data source for volunteer opportunities and for organizations. We're going to be an aggregator for jobs and other things along those lines. And then there's thousands of other websites that are aggregators. It could be thousands of other websites that are data sources. It could be mission sites that have missions postings. It could be Christian job sites. It could be organizations. And they feed into the aggregators. And then the aggregators can feed into a lot of other groups. So they will be the way that we connect with global standards like schema.org, the semantic web, search engines, social network. And just as an example of what having these standards would enable, if you type into Google your location, usually it's zip code, and you say show times, then Google will actually show you the movie times of your location, because it has intelligently parsed the data for movie times, and it can give you that result. Potentially, you could do that much more extensively across volunteer opportunities for jobs, for things along those lines. But the more the search engine understands, or the more different websites understand, the easier it is for them to present the data in multiple ways. It'll also be easier for things like Facebook Places to automatically know that this location is a church, and that automatically becomes a place in Facebook Places or Google Places for maps. And then there's also other groups that are aggregators, that are more secular aggregators, like All for Good and 211, which is the social service equivalent of emergency services 911. And then there's always going to be specialized directories. Like I mentioned, there's the Earth Day, and then there's going to be national aggregators. So All for Good is an aggregator in the United States. Almost every major government, I expect, is going to start to think about how do we aggregate volunteer opportunities and things for our people. So I've talked with a few other different governments that are starting to organize that way. And then the aggregators are also going to feed into two other groups. There's going to be Christian websites and applications, and a lot of Christian portals are very eager to create local portals, but the problem is they don't have enough local data. Now, if these groups support the semantic web and support the Christian social graph, then they're going to get a lot more local data, and they can create Christian portals regionally. There's other groups like church management systems that are starting to become much more cloud-based. As they become more cloud-based, they start to think about how do we engage not just with the church, but with the whole city and create a citywide social network. And I think that the Christian social graph is going to become more important with that. As people try to create specialized Christian social networks, I think it's going to be hard to compete with Facebook, but you can create smaller networks, maybe within a city or other groups, and this data can be useful for them, and just Christian portals in general, this data can be useful. And then the other area is, I've talked with a lot of Christian organizations that what they do is they build websites for churches, they will build websites for ministries, they build mobile apps, Facebook apps, they build widgets. A lot of them are open sourced, and a lot of them would like to do to utilize some of this data in the Christian social graph, but it hasn't been widely available. So what we want to do is try to make that available through APIs and things along those lines. So say a megachurch decides they want to develop a portal not just for their church, but for their entire city, for Christians, then they could do that by integrating all these different opportunities. Or if a megachurch wants to create a volunteer database for their church members, a lot of churches are starting to do that. With Willow Creek is doing that, placing volunteers throughout the greater Chicago area using their website, and other groups are doing that. Meet the Needs doing that with jobs. So there's a big opportunity for consultants to build custom websites. So what that brings us to is, on the Christian social graph, what we really need is to think about some standards, and here's what we're really looking at for architectural philosophy. So I'm a systems architect. That's what I studied at MIT, and whenever you're architecting, you have to say, what's the principles that's going to guide our architecture? Are we building this building based on beauty with unlimited budget, or is it cost savings? How do we fit it in with the environment? So I think that the top priority for Christian social graph standards is simplicity, because most Christian organizations aren't very sophisticated to be able to provide, extensive XML compliant or RDF compliant data. So for the next 10 years at least, we'll be lucky to get Christian organizations to provide RSS feeds or even just flat CSV files or Excel files. So we believe that the standards should just be basically like defining what fields would go on an Excel spreadsheet, a flat file or RSS feed. The other thing is we want to start where there's a felt need. There's, if you think about the Christian social graph, there's, I listed the top 10, I think, areas in the Christian social graph, but you could probably keep adding to that list forever, and that's not going to be helpful. I don't want to do, what could be helpful in an imaginary world. I want to do what's going to be helpful in a practical world. And right now, the top 3 that I've seen are volunteer opportunities, organizations, and jobs. So start with those and then move to other things that might be more difficult to do, like how do you create a comprehensive directory of all churches or all small groups or things along those lines. There has to be an incentive to share data. I think the incentive is going to work the same as RSS. The reason why people use RSS is because it drives traffic to their site. So they'll share an article with a little bit of a teaser to that article, and then someone clicks on it to see the full article. So I think the same type of principle is going to exist, but we want people to share as much as possible, because if all you do is a minimal teaser, then it's not going to help in terms of bridging some of these divides either. And then what we can do is have the aggregators then convert the simple feeds to more public global standards. So make them compliant to, for example, job postings or volunteer opportunities compliant to standards in schema.org or RDF or some of the groups that are aggregators like All for Good and 211. So that, a Christian site that has 100 volunteer opportunities doesn't have to worry about getting their volunteer opportunities to be compliant to these 10 very complicated technical standards so that they're listed in these directories. So we've started to work on a data format spec. This is really open-ended, and all of this we view as open for discussion. We're leading the way because we're feeling the need for this, because we're in the volunteering, jobs, and organization space. So the link to that is in this Google Doc, and that's going to be a public document, at least for viewing. And basically what it does is it's going to be defining optional and required field sets for each type of object. And the preferred data format would be to share it through RSS, but we also could use CSV. It would be great if most of this was automated so we didn't just email each other CSV files. And what we also want to do is to try to get data providers to standardize where possible, so that we don't create barriers. There's going to be some areas where you can't standardize, but then there's other areas that using a particular type of date format, if you're exporting it, might be helpful. To use a common date format or things along those lines. So the first part would be just defining what are those fields going to be. The second part would be creating a template for terms of use and agreeing to share the data. And there's already a lot of groups who've created these. So All for Good, Volunteer Match, GuideStar, Indeed.com, Simply Hired. They all have API terms within the space. So they've addressed a lot of the issues. And let me just say, if the secular world can share, then Christians should be able to share better. I'm going to be very sad if Christians can't at least share as well as the secular world. And they're doing it, and they're finding it works for their business models. I think Christians can do it the same way. So at some point, we would like to organize a Christian social graph working group, and that's just to define and discuss open standards and sharing agreements, and we'd like to seek potential input, especially from data providers. I think that's the first spot, but also developers utilizing the data and other Christian organizations that have a vested interest in this space. We'll probably publicly announce and seek out partners for the social graph in 2012. We're just making this presentation available at the end of 2011. One big concern about any data provider is going to be sharing data. Data providers need to share enough data to be useful to aggregators. If all you do is share the title of something, honestly, as an aggregator, I'm not even going to link to your data because you're wasting everyone's time. If you provide enough data to make it useful for someone in a search engine, then that's helpful. Obviously, there's types of data that you want to protect. You don't want to have people's email addresses available in a public API because then spammers are going to get it. And if you do provide things like say church addresses, there probably needs to be terms of use on that it's usable on a website, but they don't want you selling the church mailing list to a bunch of people so that they can send junk mail to them, or even using it for junk mail. So you can include terms that protect that data in the sharing. And the way you get that to work is you provide technical protection. So aggregators provide API keys that are tied to terms of use. So the terms of use becomes a contract between two organizations, and if it gets abused, then someone's just violated the law. And the quick solution is you just cut off their access to the feed. But if need be, if it's extremely abused, then you have a contract with that organization and legal protection in the terms of use. So some of the applications that could use the Christian Social Graph. So church management software. There's church management software increasingly is looking at how do we become a social network. I think the city, which was just recently bought by ACS, is one of the better groups that's doing that. But I think that this Christian Social Graph should be interfacing with some of these. Any church management software that wants to connect with the rest of their city needs to be connected with the social graph. Then other Christian social networks that people may build, any citywide Christian portals or social network, megachurch websites, especially where they're interested in volunteer opportunities, jobs, and events in their city, potentially classified listings, parachurch websites, volunteer opportunities, job postings, and then there's a lot of opportunities for creating widgets, creating open source modules, creating Facebook apps, mobile apps, and then consulting and system integration. So the last thing I want to talk about is understanding how network economics work. So a lot of what I studied both at MIT and since then is how network effects work. So most people have heard of Metcalfe's law, and or it's also just called the network effect, or the law of network effects. And basically what that is the value of a network is proportional to the number of people in that network squared. So Facebook is extremely valuable because you have 900 people times 900 million people times 900 million people. So that's an extremely valuable network. If I went out and said, I'm going to create Andrew's social network, and the only person who was in it was Andrew, that would not be a very valuable network. So the question is, how do you think about competing in social networks? What's important is to look at this, what I'd say is the law of network effects. So if you're going to create another network, and there's reasons you want to have subnetworks. So, Facebook isn't going to be the end-all for everything. You have LinkedIn for jobs. You have, other networks that are valuable. So you take the quality of your network. You take the uniqueness of your network. So LinkedIn has a very strong uniqueness factor. You take the scale of your network. So how many people are on LinkedIn? There's a lot of people. And it has value. So even though it's competing with Facebook, which has very high quality, even higher scale, because its uniqueness is so high, LinkedIn has value. Christian networks are the same way. Now the problem is that Christian networks don't have scale. So the only way we're going to get to scale is if we use open standards. So if we do not use open standards, what's going to happen is we're going to be assimilated. So in cultural terms, that's what is that Babylon tried to do to Israel, and the Bible has a lot to say about getting assimilated into the larger culture. And it's not that anyone has this bad agenda trying to assimilate Christians. It's just technically we're going to get assimilated if we don't have a large Christian social graph, because the scale of our network is going to be really small, and we're not going to be able to compete in any space. So, as a for instance, it would be nice if you could find a list of Christian events in my city. I know of groups that are trying to do that, but it's not very useful because it's not very comprehensive and the scale isn't very large. Now, if you are able to get all the Christian events in the world or all the Christian events in a country, then that could be useful. So we need to think about how do the part that you can really control is the scale of the network. The uniqueness is kind of defined by what domain you're in. Jobs, well, there are some people who want to apply for Christian jobs, so there's a uniqueness factor where that's important. But it's not going to be important if they can only find 100 Christian jobs on any site, which is about the way it works currently. You need to be able to get scale. So in each of these areas, this law of network effects is applying. The other issue is how do you create critical mass? Now, the way you create critical mass is you need to have your user-generated value. So this is basically, when do you go viral? I've talked with hundreds of startups, and they say, we're going to build a site, and it's going to go viral just like Facebook. So they build a site, and no one comes. And then they do that for a year or two, and then they say, I can't do this because it's not self-sustaining. So what you have to do is you have to get your network value maximized. So that's the previous equation. And then you try to get a viral rate. So what the viral rate is, at what percentage of users are adding value to your network in some way? So are they inviting other people? Are they posting content? Are they posting volunteer opportunities, posting jobs? So, if you look at Wikipedia, only 1 in 10,000 people actually post content on Wikipedia. That's the reason why even the largest Christian encyclopedias haven't been very successful. So urbanministry.org has 160,000 articles, but we haven't reached a critical mass because we get 100,000 or 200,000 visitors a month. We're not getting enough visitors to create the critical mass of editors that we need. So you start to get a positive feedback loop or going viral once the user-generated value is greater than the cost to support the network. And there's two parts of the user-generated value. There's the value that's created, the social value, and then there's the monetized value. And you really need the monetized value to be sustainable. So examples of achieving critical mass: Facebook, Craigslist, eBay, all of those at this point, they own their market. They're 80% market share, so all they have to do is sit back now and let their users create more and more value. So what the critical mass graph looks like is you start off with fixed cost, and for each user, it's going to cost you a certain rate, per user to support those users. So it's usually a straight line graph, or something along those lines. It might go down a little bit, but the issue is how do you get your user-generated value to grow exponential? And once you've done that, then you've achieved critical mass. So I've been working on this problem for the past 10 years, and I have got a good sense of how hard it is to build these networks. So TechMission has invested about $500,000 worth of cash, maybe $1 million if you actually take the real value of that with the volunteer time that we've had, probably between $1 million and $2 million. And investing $1 million to $2 million over 5 years, we've been able to get a network of 6,000 volunteer opportunities that are posted by users. And that's with, on any given year, we had 5 or 10 full-time people working on that. So these things aren't going to build themselves. It takes a lot of work. So, what I've done, and I've, used to work for venture capitalists, and what you have to do is you have to assess how much is it going to cost to actually, take on this market. And, based on my experience, I think that the Christian social graph is going to take between $100 and $500 million to build. No one has that money. So the only way we're going to do that is if we break it up into smaller pieces. So TechMission, we're taking the Christian Volunteer Opportunity Directory. That's going to take about $10 million really to get to critical mass. And we spent, I would say between $1 million and $2 million of total value on that. And we're going to keep, focusing on that. There's the Christian Jobs Directory. no one has the money to build a Christian social network, because really, to get your Christian social network large enough to be able to compete with Facebook, for one, it would probably have to be an app within Facebook, and two, it would have to be a huge network with 50 million Christians, and that's going to take $100 million to generate that network, and no one has the money to do that. So Christian social networks, no one's investing in those right now. At least a large, national or global one. People might be able to do it on, citywide. Christian jobs to get, critical mass. No one has critical mass in that space. It takes about 10 million. Christian funding directory, church directory. There's been groups that have looked at, let's try to just get all the churches, in a country or all the churches in the world available on the web. And it's been too costly to do that. American Bible Society tried to do that with forministry.com, and they haven't been able to invest very much in that to keep, that going, even though American Bible Society has $100 million. And I think a lot of the reason for that is to do that well, to keep the directory up to date, is going to take $50 million, and no one has $50 million to do that. It would take probably $50 million also to create a directory of every small group within, a given country or globally city. It would be great if I could search my city for every small group meeting in my city and find one that meets on Tuesday that is studying, James or something. Then that would be great, but it's just too expensive. So that's the scale of the problem. So the question is really, I look at, and I've spent a lot of time studying different, waves of technology innovation among Christians. There's the printing press, there's Christian radio, Christian television. The printing press brought the Protestant Reformation. So that was, I would say a pretty significant event in religion. Christian radio, people who are in the know in mission said that it's the most significant single innovation in the present mission era, and it's still extremely significant. Christian Broadcast Network alone has reported that 45 million people have decided to follow Jesus through their broadcast. Now, even if that's slightly inflated, that's still a really big number. And at its peak, religious broadcasts have represented the largest component of transnational broadcasting. Now, just to put that in perspective, imagine that the largest component of television that showed across borders was Christian, or imagine that the largest portion of internet traffic that crossed borders was Christian content. Then that was a completely different world then. So in other words, Christians dominated radio, and it was a very significant technologically advanced in advancing the gospel. Christian television, not so much. Christian television gave us televangelists and some really bad Christian TV. If you look at the Christian presence in television compared to Hollywood, it's almost negligible. So the question is, what's going to happen in the online world? Are Christians going to be splintered? And is it going to be like Christian television, where there's almost a negligible presence, or where there is a presence, you almost are apologetic or embarrassed about it? Or is it going to be more like Christian radio? And I think the thing that's really going to define that is, are we going to work together, or are we going to remain splintered? The appendix I just want to touch on real briefly. I didn't want to go into all the details, but for other elements of the social graph, we've also done some research. Churches, there's a lot of groups that have data. Schema.org actually has a church schema, and I don't think that's yet ready for standards, though. Small groups, I also don't think is ready for standards. Meetup and Eventbrite are the best sources. A lot of churches are posting their small group opportunities on Meetup. Events, Meetup and Eventful and Upcoming and Craigslist are all big, local event directories. Christians should be represented in that space, but they're not. I don't think we're ready on that. Content, really the only group that actually achieved critical mass, I would say, is GodTube. And, there's a lot of different content. There's video content, audio content, missions wikis, Catholic wikis, and there's sharing models for that. There's embedding content, like that's what YouTube does. RSS, provides a sharing model. There's Creative Commons licensing. There's an equivalent of the Wikipedia that's all in a database called DBpedia, and once you start to use RDF and semantic web, and Sparkle is an attempt to provide a database of everything, every object that's intelligible on the semantic web. So, content I don't think is ready for a standard. Classified listings, there's a few groups that are trying to create classified listings. I would say they're a factor of 1,000 or maybe a factor of 10,000 away from the scale that they need. So they have a few thousand classified listings nationally or globally, and they need a few million. Where classified listings are working are within a church. So I've seen that a local church here, Park Street, has classified listings, and a lot of churches do that through their email list. I think we need to think about how do we share our classified listings, citywide, because that could be pretty useful. I have lots of friends that are looking for Christian roommates. They can't find them because, each church has their own little silo where they're keeping their classifieds, and we need standards for that, but honestly, we're not ready for that. So that's the end. If you have questions, you can go and find out more about TechMission at techmission.org. You can contact me. My email address is andrew@techmission.org. Our phone number you can find on our website, and contact me if you have any questions. So that's it.